We have another really important topic. It's exploring environmental market opportunities and also the risks and key considerations before entering the market. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who is Kate Carmichael, a consultant with Pinion Advisory. After growing up in a farming family, Kate has gained experience in ag tech, greenhouse gas accounting and the regulated carbon market. She loves to help demystify all these complex issues for farmers. Yes, please, Kate, that will be wonderful. Please welcome Kate to talk about navigating environmental markets in agriculture. Thank you.
Thanks, Kerry, for that introduction, and thank you as well to the speakers that we had this morning. I'd just like to shout out how amazing those three presentations were, and I'm feeling quite inspired by how it all kind of unfolded, which was really exciting, and it's great to see these kind of days happening. So thanks as well to the NCCMA for getting this off the ground. So today I'm going to be talking about navigating environmental markets in agriculture. So what we're going to cover is kind of the driving forces behind these markets, and then I'm going to talk about two specific mechanisms, which is carbon markets and biodiversity markets. We're also going to cover off on some of the principles and considerations of engaging in these markets, what you need to be able to demonstrate in order to generate some income from these opportunities, and also what you should be considering before you dive into them as well. And of course, as always, we're going to finish with some key messages and questions. So we've already been through these definitions, the first one anyway, and the second I think as well. So natural capital is another term for the stock of renewable and non-renewable resources that combine to yield a flow of benefits to the people. So I think that's been quite well covered in the first session, as well as the natural capital accounting, kind of the metrics that are grounded in the background. We talked about the UNCR. So there's these kind of global metrics that exist and global frameworks that exist for actually quantifying natural capital. Now, the step, I guess, in the next direction, step forward from those two is kind of markets. And a natural capital market or an environmental market is something that enables landholders to monetize the natural capital that they actually have on farm. So Katie also put up a similar diagram to this one, but I'll just run through this quite quickly because I think it's a good indicator. Oh, we do have a laser of how this kind of how our society functions and how these environmental markets are really grounded. So there's two, ideas behind sustainability in the literature that's kind of been emerging from the 60s, I suppose. So you've got a 3 pillars version, which is that economic, social, and environmental factors all kind of combine to contribute to an overall sustainability, which is known as 3 pillars. We also have this idea of nested sustainability, which I think is actually really important when you're thinking about natural capital markets. So that's the idea that without a functioning environment, we as a society exist within that, and obviously our economy exists within that as well. So we really need to be able to put some kind of financial value on the environment because it does contribute ultimately to the economy in the end, and actually the economy is entirely reliant on a functioning environment and ecosystems as well. So the relevance to agriculture with these is that obviously it's a kind of land-based production business, agriculture in Australia. Landholders can consider that they have ecosystems present on site, and if you're looking at generating additional income to fund additional activities, there are potential markets that you can engage in to fund some of those activities like carbon sequestration and improved biodiversity outcomes. So the two main ones there are carbon credits and then biodiversity credits or certifications. It's really important to highlight at this stage that the operational suitability of entering an environmental market, a carbon project, a biodiversity offset, you really need to consider that within the context of your entire business. So it's not just purely something that generates income, it's also your natural capital contributes to the sustainability of your operation without necessarily generating a dollar value, as we've kind of heard from the speakers before. But if you have these kind of additional activities and you're working within these regulated frameworks, you can actually generate a saleable asset as well. Some of the market drivers we've talked about as well. I'm probably going to talk in a little bit more detail on the Science-Based Targets Initiative, but Some drivers that are existing within the supply chain are the Science Based Targets Initiative, the Task Force on Climate-related Financial Disclosures, the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures. There are things like Climate Active, so that's obviously the carbon neutral certification within Australia that basically anyone looking to certify a product as carbon neutral will usually have to purchase some carbon credits in order to have that certification, so that drives the carbon market along as well. And then you also have GRI, which is basically a corporate reporting standard that exists globally. So all of these kind of drivers sit in the background of these corporate companies or, larger companies that are reporting to these kind of standards or signing up to these science-based targets initiatives. And that's what's really the driving force in behind making these things happen on farm, and also being able to have that visibility with your supply chain of what you're actually implementing on the ground and how that's contributing to their overall organisational strategy as well. There are some regulatory drivers, the safeguard mechanism being probably one of the most significant ones in Australia for the carbon market. So any company that emits over 100,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent in Australia is under the safeguard mechanism. And if they're exceeding their baseline emissions or their set emissions targets, they actually need to purchase carbon credits or safeguard mechanism credits in order to come back under that baseline. As Katie touched on as well, there's also the Australian Sustainability Reporting Standards, which are coming out in the next couple of years. So larger organisations will be reporting from January and then filtering down into smaller organisations by 2027. So that's reporting on kind of climate risk and things that are going to impact the operation. But it's just really important to consider that all of these things exist in the background of these natural capital markets and are probably important things to factor in as well as you consider engaging with your supply chain on issues like greenhouse gas emissions, emissions intensity, and demonstrating kind of the natural capital that you actually have on farm. Another good example of a regulatory mechanism for a biodiversity market is the New South Wales Biodiversity Offset Scheme, which is basically a mandatory offset. If there's some specific species that's being destroyed in order to build a railway or a hospital, then that needs to be offset in another area in perpetuity. So that's kind of a regulated mechanism for a biodiversity credit. So what is the SBTI? Show of hands, who's heard of the SBTI? Who's heard that kind of phrase? So getting up there, decent amount, but still some people who aren't quite familiar. So the Science Based Targets Initiative is a global kind of target pathway that corporates can sign up to in order to deliver either a net zero strategy or a decarbonisation pathway. It relies on externally validated targets that are focusing on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. These are done through official protocols that have been published by the SBTI, and the grounding information in that is really from the greenhouse gas protocols and some international protocols as well from the IPCC and the ISO 140 series. So that's a little bit of jargon, sorry, but I have to drop it in there when I can. The targets are considered science-based basically because they're grounded in the Paris Agreement, which is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and to pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. So that's kind of the idea behind why the SBTI exists. There will be corporates that sign up to this target which are aiming to decarbonise by a set date, so whether that's 2040, 2045 or 2050. There is specific guidance for forest, land and agriculture within the Science Based Targets Initiative. So that applies to agricultural operations, and as a farmer, you will basically be the scope 3 of some of these larger companies that are signing up to these targets. This is actually quite an interesting statistic here. So 88% of emissions worldwide by market capitalisation are actually currently covered under a science-based target. That's 8,380 companies. I was looking at some 2022 data and I almost had on this slide 34% of global emissions. So quite lucky I checked. As I'm sure you're aware, this is quite a quickly evolving space and things do change quite dramatically. So I thought that was quite a good illustration of that. There is a requirement for any organisation that has 40% or above of their emissions from their Scope 3 contributing to their overall emissions to have a Scope 3 target. And when we talk about what does it mean to be a Scope 3, primary producers are really the suppliers. They supply the companies that have made these targets. So you've got targets like JBS going for net zero by 2040, and Cargill's, which is reducing the emissions intensity of their extended supply chain by 30% by 2030. Cargill has an interesting market mechanism that's coming live in Australia in their sustain cert. I'm not sure of the exact name, but basically there's going to be a premium applied where kind of more sustainable farming practices have been implemented on site. Coles is a really interesting one. They were sort of first in the Australian game to come through with quite a tangible target, I think. So last year, Coles announced that 75% of their Scope 3 suppliers are to have a plan for emissions reduction by 2027. So this is kind of an idea of what's coming down the line. The drivers for the carbon market in Australia, as we've kind of discussed, there's this safeguard mechanism, so larger organisations, larger entities which are doing lots of emitting, they will have to buy credits to offset some of those emissions. There's also voluntary, so companies that are seeking to purchase carbon credits in order to offset some other emissions that they are having difficulty reducing the emissions for. So basically, when we look at carbon credits, there's two kind of approaches. So we have the ACCU scheme, which you could also call like a regulated scheme. So that's where the demand is driven by both the federal government and industry. So the Australian government purchases ACCUs, which are only available under the ACCU scheme in order to meet their emissions reduction targets under global agreements. There's also that industry drive behind the safeguard mechanism and voluntary purchase of carbon credits to decarbonise. So these are required for our national greenhouse gas account reporting, basically. They all feed into the Paris Agreement and our climate targets under that as well. So these carbon credits can be voluntarily purchased as offsets. They can also be surrendered by organisations that generate them as well. Then you also have the voluntary carbon market. So this is outside of the ACCU scheme. You won't generate an ACCU if you participate in a voluntary carbon project, but basically, there are organisations like the Verified Carbon Standard, which is a type of credit that Verra delivers, or Gold Standard, which have these kind of different approaches to carbon sequestration and measurement, monitoring, evaluation and reporting. And basically what you're generating with a carbon credit is 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent sequestered or avoided equals 1 carbon credit. These should all follow internationally recognised principles of integrity, kind of regardless of the scheme that they're involved in, whether that's voluntary or the ACCU scheme. Some of the methodologies that are available to producers in Australia, we've got under agriculture, there's soil carbon and beef cattle herd management. I think that beef cattle herd management generally more focused in the northern regions of Australia with those sort of larger herd sizes of 1,000 breeders or more. There's also vegetation methodologies, which are obviously land-based and can happen on farms, so things like environmental plantings, plantation forestry. Human-induced regeneration has been the subject of much kind of debate, I suppose, in the public sphere. That was sunset in September 2023, and with the cancellation of the proposal for the integrated farm and land methodology, that's actually been put on hold basically indefinitely at this point. Not sure if anyone in Victoria is getting involved in savanna burning, savanna fire management, but that one's there as well if anyone plays in kind of the larger spaces in Northern Australia. There is also a proponent-led methodology proposal and development process, which is kind of coming online as well. As far as I know, we haven't seen any actual methodologies come through from that, but there is just this potential for individual proponents that aren't necessarily the government to come up with methodologies that pass all of the robust tests in terms of quantification. So the project life cycle of an ACCU scheme project, I'm just going to do this quite quickly because I've not gone through this in the best time, but that's okay. Thanks. Good, nice. So first of all, you have to identify a project. So from that list of methodologies that was on the previous slide, you need to be able to identify a project where you meet that eligibility threshold. So if you're thinking of doing something like a soil carbon project, there are certain parameters that you need to meet For example, there can't have been any land clearing to take place in the previous 7 years. You need to have eligible interest holder consent, so that would be consent from the banks if you have a mortgage, and consent from all of the people who are actually listed on the land title as well. And then you would also need to do what we call an eligible activity, and I'll talk about this on the next slide, but this is that core facet of additionality. So a lot of the questions from carbon markets come from, okay, so I've got 40 hectares of kind of beautiful remnant vegetation. Can I generate a carbon credit from that? And the answer is no, and that's down to additionality. Basically, what happens with additionality is that under the kind of global frameworks, the carbon that is sequestered and credited as a financial instrument needs to be additional in that it would not have happened otherwise. So that's kind of that baseline requirement for actually generating a credit. I'd just like to clarify that having 40 hectares of remnant vegetation is a beautiful thing that will enhance the productivity and profitability of your farm as well. So it's certainly not something that's been lost, but just something that you're not necessarily able to capitalise on in terms of a carbon credit. There's also some quite strict requirements on how you deliver the project, so you need to map it out quite accurately. You need to follow a specific methodology of soil sampling and report all of this to the Clean Energy Regulator. There's also a permanence obligation that will need to be met in land-based methodologies. That's generally 25 or 100 years. So really considering if you're thinking of getting into a carbon project, that time frame is probably one of the more important things as well. There'll also be a minimum number of audits associated with your project too, so you'll have to go through at least 3 audits throughout the project lifecycle. And then once you actually get to the point of generating credits, those will be distributed into an ANREU account, and at that point you're either able to surrender those to offset your own emissions if you would like to. You can sell them in an auction as well. Or you can kind of keep them and bank them until you just figure out exactly how you'd like to proceed with the carbon credit, if that's eventual sale or if that's kind of offsetting in the near future. Some of the core carbon principles that I was just talking about that feed into these methodologies. So program governance, basically just looking that the methodologies are sound under those international standards. In Australia, under the ACCU scheme, we have ERAC. So that's basically an assurance committee that vets the methodologies to make sure that they are sound and represent kind of legitimate abatement. The additionality requirement, which I have kind of talked about already. And then there's the no double counting. So I guess what that means is that if you're generating carbon credits, and then say you've generated 100 carbon credits, and then you have 200 tonnes of emissions associated with your farm in a year, then if you sell your 100 carbon credits, you then cannot count those 100 carbon credits against your own balance sheet. So just important to note that if you are selling these kind of carbon credits, then that's it, they're done. You can't count them within your own boundary anymore. Permanence obligations, that's generally 25 to 100 years under ACCU scheme projects in Australia. One of the really important things here is insetting versus offsetting. So insetting is basically building measurable carbon on farm to reduce your net greenhouse gas balance. So if you do have that 40 hectares of beautiful remnant vegetation, then there is no specific framework currently, but it is kind of hoped that eventually there will be the ability to have some recognition of that against your own on-farm carbon balance. So Climate Active, which does the carbon neutral certifications, is kind of under a bit of assessment over the last year, and I believe it's with the Senate committee, or was in the last couple of months. And so basically that's just looking at a recognition of the sequestration that's actually happening on site when that carbon hasn't kind of been sold, that can actually offset your own greenhouse gas emissions without that technical framework and needing to necessarily sign up to a carbon project. I will caveat that slightly by saying this is not really an approved mechanism at the moment, but I've heard Richard Eckhardt speak on it a number of times, and I'd be really keeping a close eye on this in the next couple of years to see if there's any movement on what that actually means on farm. Thank you. So offsetting is where a business would offset their emissions through the purchase of carbon credits, basically. So if you're looking at selling a carbon neutral product and you have those 200 tonnes of CO2e emissions, then you use your 100 carbon credits that you've generated to offset that 100, you would need to purchase an additional 100 in order to kind of achieve that carbon neutrality. Moving across into biodiversity markets. So the Nature Repair Act, which came into play in December 2023, is probably one of the significant ones to be aware of at this point. So the Clean Energy Regulator is establishing the systems and processes that this is going to need in order to operate. They're anticipating that this market will open in 2025. The primary drivers behind the biodiversity kind of credit or biodiversity certificate, as it would be under the Nature Repair Act, are companies looking at reporting against the TNFD, so looking at mitigating biodiversity losses within the supply chain, and also, sorry, I wrote these down. Companies that are doing kind of the voluntary ESG reporting as well, and also looking at co-benefits for carbon projects. So when we talk about co-benefits, has anyone heard of the Carbon Plus Biodiversity pilots that happened in the last 2 years? Yeah, so these were basically carbon projects with attached biodiversity benefits. So these pilot schemes where you're linking together carbon plus biodiversity, you can attract potentially a premium on the value of that credit because you're able to demonstrate those additional environmental outcomes beyond just simple carbon sequestration. So the Carbon Plus Biodiversity pilots were an Australian-wide initiative. That hasn't come into play on a large scale just yet, but with the Nature Repair Act currently under development, hopefully we'll see some kind of progress on that as well. The Queensland Land Restoration Fund and the Western Australian Land Restoration Fund are kind of good examples of that as well. There are also some voluntary certifications that you can look into that kind of consider environmental outcomes and biodiversity outcomes. So these are the Accounting for Nature framework. There's also ecological outcome verification. I've just put in there Nature Plus, which is a credit that's based off the Accounting for Nature standard, which has worked in with green collar. So I'm sorry if I've lost a few of you there, that's maybe a little bit confusing, but basically there are some market mechanisms already existing out there for these biodiversity credits that if you're interested in exploring them, then by all means, I think that's, you know, not a bad thing to kind of do. In waiting to see what the Nature Repair Act delivers once it's actually fully structured out, I think I was reading that the focus is going to be on kind of protection of waterways and biodiversity, First Nations engagement as well in a lot of those projects. Basically, how that's going to look as instead of one single carbon credit, a project under the Nature Repair Act will generate one single biodiversity certificate. And these will be all available on a public kind of listing and market. So the purchases of these, as I've said, would be companies reporting under the TNFD or for their ESG reporting. Some other considerations, of course, there's a lot of these. So there is some emerging sustainable finance instruments, as they're termed. So the National Australia Bank has an initiative called Green Finance. CBA and Rabobank are both doing what they're calling sustainability-linked loans. So there is some potential that if you are looking into some of these activities, like a carbon project, like a biodiversity project as well, that there may be avenues for kind of financing those. Of course, building your natural capital on farm can contribute to the value of your land as well as the improved productivity and environmental outcomes. I think we've covered that quite well. I think this is probably one of the most important parts to consider if you're thinking about entering an environmental market. Make sure you're doing your research on service providers. Make sure you're considering the market access of kind of retaining those natural capital benefits on site instead of actually selling those off. And then also really make sure that you're considering what your goal is for your farm in terms of A, your carbon emissions, or B, you know, how you'd like to see your biodiversity and natural capital contribute to the sustainability of your business. There's also some education programs out there. So Carbon Edge with MLA, small shout out, we are running one of those in Bendigo in August, so that will be a good one. There's also the Carbon Neutral Agriculture course with the University of Melbourne, which delves into a lot more detail. Having been developed by Richard Eckhart, I'd say it's pretty safe to say that one it does not favour carbon markets and these kind of solutions, but it's important to do your research because there are certainly diverse perspectives on what this actually means for agriculture. also just want to shout out to the AgVic on-farm emissions pilot, which is going to be speaked about next, a really excellent program that kind of grounds all this knowledge in what's happening on farm in terms of your carbon emissions and how you can come up with an action plan to address that. And we're hopefully going to see at the federal level the carbon farming outreach program, an education program for farmers on managing carbon on farm emerging. So just to finalise, so natural capital markets are available now. You are able to participate in these schemes right now. So that's something that you can consider, you know, not as like a future thing, but something that's actually available at the moment. I think when you're doing that, it's really important, of course, to consider what it means to be a Scope 3 supplier as companies decarbonise that you're going to be supplying to. Do a cost-benefit analysis for anything if you're considering entering these programs. There are quite significant things that you need to sign up to as well. And I think that's my time, so that's basically it.
Thanks, Kate. I hate to shut anyone down, but I suspect that there might be a question or two in the room. So we really want to, don't run away. We've got a question down the front here from Kate. We'll get you a microphone, Kate.
Another one, excuse me. What is through? Thanks, Kate. It's a really good presentation. Right at the end there, when you mentioned considering the Scope 3 exposure and talked earlier about insetting and offsetting and how if you develop credits for yourself, you can hold them and count them as inset against your own emissions balance, but if you sell them to someone else, they're not your credits anymore. You've done the work, but someone else gets literally the credit. Do you think that there might be a risk for people talking about things like a deforestation regulation if they're considering what it means to be exposed in that Scope 3 sense, that a supply chain person might say, show me your biodiversity, and you might have to say, I've sold my biodiversity to someone else? Is that a genuine concern, or is that more just an abstract concept that won't really come into play?
I think at this stage, you would be able to use that project as kind of a demonstration of what's actually happening on site. Of course, you wouldn't be able to necessarily claim any sort of offset or credit associated with that, but I think it does contribute to a story of your organisation that you do kind of take this seriously and that you are putting effort and work in to improve the value of your natural capital or improve the carbon sequestration of your farm. So I don't think that value is entirely lost if you're selling credits, but certainly you're not able to count them against any of your own targets, and your supplier will also not be able to count them as an emissions reduction. So if there was one risk, I would say that if suppliers are going to start potentially targeting producers that can demonstrate a lowered emissions intensity, if you have kind of sold off all of your carbon credits, that may open you to a bit of exposure because you don't have that sequestration potential to inset against your emissions. I'd also shout out that you don't have to sell all of your credits. You can kind of, if you're engaging in these markets, you can keep some, offset some, you know. It's not one way or the other. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks, Kate. Great presentation. I just had a question on, I think it was one of the last slides, you said one of the things you really have to think about is your service providers. Do you have a sort of list of questions or things that would be good to ask service providers if you're looking into these projects?
I certainly have one in my head. I don't necessarily have one that I would be able to deliver. But I think one good place to look is the Carbon Market Institute does have a register of service providers that are signatories to the Carbon Market Industry Code of Conduct. So that's a great place to start. If you're thinking about getting into carbon markets, have a look at that list and then talk to each of the providers individually. And I think as you discover more about the methodologies you're considering, you'll be able to come up with some good questions about exactly what this means. And make sure you're getting them in writing too, would be my suggestion. Do it in an email rather than a phone call.
Right, we have time for another question. Jim.
Back through again, guys.
Thanks, Kate. That's great. One conundrum that's always concerned me about the carbon markets is how do you reconcile this need for additionality with then the avoided loss one, which is no additionality? So isn't just maintaining your 40 hectare remnant avoided loss, and therefore why can't you claim it? I mean, I know you don't make the rules, but I just don't get it.
I'll take that right to the UN. No, I think that I have to tread carefully here, I suppose, in terms of what I say, because I have some personal views on this, which I'm not sure will be appropriate on stage, but feel free to ask me afterwards. I think that when you're considering that, the look at avoided emissions versus sequestration, which is actually happening, there is certainly a difference, because 1 tonne sequestered means 1 tonne removed from the atmosphere. 1 tonne avoided from being emitted still means that the same amount of carbon is in the atmosphere. These carbon mechanisms don't currently kind of account for that variation, but it is an interesting question. In terms of the additionality requirement on something that's already sequestering carbon, basically at a global scale, if we're kind of considering that what we have is enough in order to reduce our emissions and, you know, credit things that are already happening, I just don't know if that's going to give us the kind of necessary cut through that we need to actually have an impact on climate change and reducing emissions.
One last question, if there's any. Oh, here we are, over here.
Hi, Anthony Gallagher from Landcare Victoria. The latest term that I had heard bandied around was carbon resetting, which is the way they described it was a small number of impact investors who want to actually remove carbon from the system and will actually buy up ACCUs and retire them from, essentially put them in a no-go zone from the system. And it's only apparently a very small little thing. And I just wanted to see if you'd heard that term, or is it just a brand new sort of emerging thing as well?
I've actually never heard that term, but I'm going to do some reading on it. If there's people out there who are funding climate action through just the purchase and surrender of credits, then I think that's probably a good thing. But yeah, it's not something that I'm specifically familiar with.
Yep. Thanks.